I don't believe our panelists need introduction. What binds them all together is that they all have compelling stories to tell about peacemaking and about the art of trying to weave in the moment of complexity, in the moment of atrocities, in the moment of just sheer human scale, how they try to weave through very patiently some kind of peace deal as well. This conversation is ever more pertinent today because when you look across the world, what we see is wars rising. We see more and more human suffering, many refugees, displacement. We're going to have a conversation later in the forum on accountability and justice and impunity, and these are things that the three of you have worked on. So it's a real privilege for me, for Crisis Group, as the president and CEO of Crisis Group, to be moderating a session with Foreign Minister for Norway, with the chief negotiator for a crucial peace process in the Philippines, the Bangsamoro, and also with the United States envoy for Sudan, before that also for the Great Lakes as well. So let me start with you, Foreign Minister, because Norway, since the 1990s, and I stayed behind deliberately this morning after the opening session, Foreign Minister, to listen to your conversations with the Prime Minister on sort of conflict resolution. And the big theme in that session was about the need for us to start thinking outside the box. But you have made an important argument also that we need to not throw out the toolbox, not throw out the principles and the norms that guide us, because Norway has been sort of the architect of various peace agreements. And you have a very good sort of historical success stories from the 1990s when I think about the various roles that you have played, whether it's in Africa, in Latin America, Central America, and Middle East, and you're doing that today. What are the lessons, Foreign Minister? Because quite frankly, the picture today does not look good. All the guardrails, all the tools that we'd normally use, the norms, mediation itself is under severe strain. Short of saying that we're failing, what are the key lessons from the 1990s or since the 1990s that you think bear thinking about today for mediators? Because as the title says of the theme of our session is that where have all the peace deal gone? And you may have an interesting story for all of us as we're thinking through gravely what the next chapter looks like.
Thank you, Comfort. That's a really compelling question, so I'll try to answer it with something relevant and interesting, not too long. But I think it's critically important to start in the 1990s because we had this unique moment where at least the perception was, I'm not suggesting necessarily the reality 100%, but the perception was that the world was on a good move towards something to a better recognition of a set of norms and principles and even models for statehood. And more countries were cooperating. So basically the well-functioning economies of the world in East and West and increasingly also South, agreed on key principles. And then we had a number of residual unfinished businesses. We had, the transition problems of Eastern Europe, the war in the Balkans. We had several old conflicts in the Middle East or in Asia, Latin America, Africa that had been going on for a while, and maybe there was a new opportunity. And when we were trying to design a direction, it was a relatively broad agreement that a democratic model of government, sharing of power, some kind of compromise, these were good things that you could strive through. So even if while people were killing each other, it was possible to envisage some kind of common form of where you were heading, because you always need a direction. And that is less obvious now because of geopolitical tensions and less agreement on what a good model is. than we once had. So I think that's a key point. That's no argument for giving up. It's actually an argument for just working harder and also recognize what is different. And what we have learned is that it's important that we speak to everybody. If you actually want to get something done, you have to deal with the people who matter, even if they have blood on their arms, and even if you don't necessarily like what they've done or even like them. But you need to have ability to speak to, and if necessary, if need be, discreetly to many. You need to stay long term, because sometimes being present, the Philippines is a good case. We were involved, and together with many good forces in the Philippines for many, many, many years, where not much happened. And suddenly there was a moment where we could seize the opportunity. So stay long term, don't go away, keep contacts, keep some presence, and then seize the moment when the moment arrives, because there will be opportunities, and then you have to identify and go all in and say, this is the opportunity. And then the last lesson I think we've learned is that try to find out what the different parties really want. Because if on first impression they compete over the same, sometimes you realize that they're actually asking for different things. And that their main asks may actually be more compatible than they think. But then you need to sit down, listen carefully, politely, respectfully, and say, what is it that you really want? I see your long list. You will not get all of that. But what is it that really matters? And what does the other side, or the other sides, because it's often in plural, really want? And see if you can still create something where many of these asks are, to a large extent, 80% achieved, if not 100%, and you can get to something which is better than continued conflict. So it's complicated, but there are experiences there. We are in Qatar, so I want to mention again that we work closely with this country, because I think Qatar has made many of the same experiences in its work on peace mediation.
Minister, while you still have the mic, I want to push you a little bit further, based on sort of your observations and what you sort of the lessons learned on what's working and what's not working. Where would you say those 3 points that you've just outlined, where do you think there are seeds, those seeds have been planted? Where would you point to as maybe a reasonable example of what you think are the roots of a sustainable process, or the beginnings of a sustainable process today?
Well, I mean, let me take one case which has been quite successful, which is quite recent, which is the Colombia peace process, where we understood that there was an emerging agreement that the conflict had to come to an end after more than 50 years. People were tired. There was sort of a mutually hurting stalemate. It was not solving itself by military force. But you also needed to recognize the government's need to bring order to the entirety of the country, to get the state back, but also the former guerrilla fighters' desire to deal with some key issues of land reform and redistributional issues. And where's one case where you can, and you need to deal with transitional justice, you need to remember there were victims, you could not ignore the victims, but you could not put everybody in jail either. So how could you manage to have a transitional justice, for instance? So this is a case where one has seen some progress, because much of this appeared. And in this region, I will say it is terrible and it's getting worse. I mean, sorry, but that's how it looks right now. But the increasing agreement between key regional players, that because it is so bad, they have to lay aside some of their more petty differences and try to coalesce around some common positions, again based on some common norms. I think that is a silver lining, and I think that could be used now to move the intricate and deeply related conflicts in this region forward.
Thank you, and I'll come back. I think there'll be good points of connections between you. But Minister, thank you for mentioning the Philippines, and it's a real sort of pleasure to. I should also confess that also it's my boss who's on the panel with me, because Miriam is also a trustee of Crisis Group. So it's a delight to have her on the panel, because you have quite a diverse sort of practitioners sort of guidelines on what makes for good peacemaking and what makes for good mediation from Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan. But I want to start where you're working now as a chief mediator, working in the peace process in the Bangsamoro, the Muslim majority region in the Mindanao and in the Philippines region. I wanted to sort of tease out from you, listening to what Minister Espen has just been saying. Now, what do you think contributes to making for a viable or viable peace deals, based on what you've seen in the Philippines, but also drawing on lessons from Iraq, Kosovo, and elsewhere in Afghanistan as well? What makes for a viable peace deal that can explain and help us think about today as well?
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, our thanks to Norway for actually being part of the Bangsamoro peace process, supporting the ceasefire, and now the elements related to the decommissioning of weapons and combatants, but not so much successful yet with the other table, with the Communist Party of the Philippines, which remains the last armed group that has to reach a peace agreement. We've had 4 peace agreements with different armed groups. And in this case, with the More Islamic Liberation Front, when we signed the agreement in 2014, we ended up, after 17 years of negotiations, 4 presidents, because each president had their different approaches. So actually, when he came in, it was trying to recover from what had failed before, but at the same time picking up from the elements that have already been put in place. For example, we do have a very good ceasefire mechanism. I know it's more intuitive to think that the ceasefire should precede political settlement, but as you see in Colombia, they had no ceasefire, but got, in any case, to some form of de-escalation and succeeded in really coming up with a very comprehensive agreement. But it was very, very important for us to make sure that the situation on the ground is managed, because violence will always happen. It will happen before you actually negotiate, during negotiations, and even after you negotiate. So if you don't have that kind of mechanism to see to it that the ground situation is addressed, that there are effective these mechanisms across, especially between the 2 parties, then the political process gets stymied. And we almost suffered from that when one major violence happened and the process was put in jeopardy, precisely because this is not a very popular process. There's a lot of historical bias in a Catholic majority population against the Muslims historically, but also recently, because we also do have some of the other kinds of groups operating in our interspecies. But in any case, I think at the end of the day, it's really the political will of the 2 parties. That's very, very important, to see through the process, not only to get to a stage when they think they need a peace agreement or this is the preferred path, but to really see through all the intricacies, because this is a very difficult process. You have to get your own constituencies on board. And government is not monolithic. Government is made up of different agencies. We have a presidential system, which means the Congress is separate. Supreme Court has at one point actually nullified one agreement that was about to be signed. So it was very, very important for the government to have that kind of one line of march through what we have called as a peace policy, or the primacy of the peace process, overriding most of the considerations, including some of the very basic security considerations at the time, because different armed groups operate the same spaces, and we had to clearly distinguish the moderate forces with whom we were negotiating and those that we were actually still fighting. So political leadership, the will to see this through, the will to bring your own constituency. Of course, in our case, we had a much broader constituency than the More Islamic Liberation Front, but it was also important for them to bring their constituency here, because there are doubts, there's distrust. And commanders have probably in the different areas, in fact, they've lost some of them to the more radical groups already while we were still negotiating. So that kind of challenge to ensure that the political will is spent, the political capital is spent on this at great risk to the leaders of the armed group, the leaders of the government. And then the other factor, which I already mentioned, has to do with the different kinds of mechanisms. And the mechanisms that you put in place while you're still negotiating and when you're implementing. I mean, these are things that you need to think about. It's not about thinking about these implementation mechanisms after you have signed an agreement. These all have to come in because the bigger challenge after you sign is precisely being able to implement. And if you did not have like a whole set of fairly inclusive mechanisms that will create that kind of ownership and allow for participation in the different arenas, whether it's the legislative track, the governance track, or even the security track, and certainly the other aspects relating to the normalization of the situation. So I think I'll just mention these two things, but certainly it takes much, much more than these two things to come to a good process.
Those are two vital pillars that you've just highlighted, and when you locate the lessons upon your reflections, when you locate them in today's crises, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's in the Sahel, I'll leave aside Sudan because we're going to come to that with you, Tom. But when you look at your experience in the Philippines, do you have any hope that you can strike that comprehensive peace deal today? I mean, you and the foreign minister seem to have a good story first on Colombia and now on the Philippines, but today, quite frankly, we don't necessarily share your optimism, but please, yeah.
Yeah, but I think we also need to temper our expectations, not to expect too much that you can have all of these comprehensive peace agreements, and it's the only pathway. That is the only pathway to get to some things moving. We need to take into account, I mean, if you look at the data provided to us by the Global Peace Index, they said that there's really much fewer peace agreements, comprehensive, peace agreements now that's happening, but maybe we're not counting other stuff that need to be built into this, into the picture of the peace building that's going on. There's a lot of dialogues that are going on. There's a lot of local peace building, including local peace agreements that are taking place. There are the indigenous mechanisms used by indigenous communities to settle their own disputes, and there's a lot of preventive diplomacy that's being done, but never really counted as really, it doesn't get into the statistic of a peace agreement precisely because it prevented the conflict. So we can see that the dialogues that are also being initiated at different levels, the lobbying to parties that are taking place so that they actually sit down. These all make up the elements of putting the pieces in place. So maybe at the end of the day, you go through, you might still need like some kind of a formal peace agreement, but the steps, the elements are being there, and there are a lot of much more people, especially at the local level, who are doing this thing. So I think we should not really, we should take a look at the range and then let's see. Maybe we'll get a much better picture there.
Your optimism is important because I'm going to move to what I think is, the headline is very much around Gaza, around Ukraine, but then we have Sudan, which quite frankly is the worst sort of humanitarian crisis that we're witnessing today. And Tom, you've been the envoy for the United States since February of this year. When you listen to sort of the story, the examples, the lessons learnt that both the foreign minister and the chief negotiator, Professor Miriam, have been articulating, what do you see as the most difficult challenge and obstacle that you are facing in trying to bring the two principal actors to the negotiation table in Sudan? This is the General Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and then the head of the paramilitary armed forces, Hemeti. What do you see as the most difficult challenges? And it'd be really good to sort of get your own candid reflections, even as the process is going on as we speak today.
Thank you, Dr. Iro, and thank you for your leadership. When we think about how many trends have been negative over the last 20 years on many issues related to peace and stability, I would say that ICG as an institution is one that's actually gotten stronger and lived up to its potential, and your leadership is no small part of that, along with the board members and trustees. I will start with a semi-positive note on Sudan as an effort to try to perhaps bridge into how we might need to think about things. So if you go back to July of this year, you had over 20 million people in Sudan facing acute hunger, as you do today. You had probably several million facing starvation, but the data was hard to get, in part because there's been so little coverage in the country and the rest. And I would say there was a fair amount of diplomatic paralysis about Sudan, in part because there seemed to be no ability to get the two actors to the table. When we put together what became known as the ALPS talks, nobody really thought they had a chance to succeed, and we had a number of countries, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, the Swiss, along with the African Union and the United Nations. And we really put together what were a mix of what you would consider sort of proximity talks, hybrid talks, virtual talks. And really what made it work was that we had a group of people in the room that were very serious about solving the problem, particularly starting with the humanitarian problem, including the technical experts, and people who had sufficient relationships with both sides that we could isolate in on what exactly needed to be the priority for that day of opening up humanitarian corridors and the rest. And then we would go out and negotiate with the parties, often using, telephones and modern technology. We've not only got the three major humanitarian routes open at those talks, we've met virtually every single week with no plane tickets purchased, no issues of visas and the rest. And part of what we knew going into that is that the parties in Sudan, the factions in Sudan, have known how to play the game for a long time of using humanitarian access as a weapon, as a diplomatic strategy, playing around with invitations and who's getting invited in this way and that way. And part of what we were doing with the talks was trying to bring the hardliners to the surface, kind of embarrass themselves, get a little more marginalized, to make room for some of the more moderate and serious people, particularly in the SAF side. So that we've continued to have 5 straight months of significant gains on humanitarian access on what has effectively been a blockade of 25 million people that, of course, nobody in the world seems to know is going on, so nobody's there to celebrate the progress. Now, we have a lot more work to do. I don't want to in any way undermine that the humanitarian crisis remains that large, but we are seeing weekly flights to Kassala and Donggala and Kadugli. We're seeing increased volume out of both the Port Sudan side and the Adre side. We're looking at places where we can have humanitarian corridors and the rest. So I think I say that in part because I think in addition to looking backwards to what worked in the 90s, we also have to realize that bad actors have been learning a lot about those tools that we've done. We also live in a different world because of social media and other dynamics. And so I think we also want to be disrupting some of those models of how we've done it before and try to work backwards from what do we need done. And in that case, we didn't need people physically present. Necessarily, though that remains usually the gold standard. But what we did need is people who had leverage on the two sides. We knew that there was constant circles being run where we would each get a slightly different answer from HAC about exactly where the visas were and that sort of thing. So trying to, I think, work backwards from how you solve that problem is important. In the issue of getting the two parties together in this case, there are many barriers. And again, I still think it would be the best way to proceed. But it's not, in fact, we don't want to mix up means and ends. And so that is a means to getting to the end, which is ceasefire and or deal. And the question is, what are other mechanisms that may help to do that? And many people, both state and non-state actors, have, of course, been trying to do that in the Sudan case. I think the number of barriers to success just are too long to list here. But I do think that we have an enormous global silence on Sudan. I think that not only creates less pressure on the internal actors, but also some of the external actors in this case. We haven't seen that, not just from Western civil society, but even from African civil society and media coverage. We're getting some more of that now. And a number of factors can play into that, one of which, of course, is that we are seeing a trend around the world of anti-incumbency or of long-time incumbents being thrown out of power. And we have a lot of governments that are very focused on their domestic politics. And that often means there's either less bandwidth or less length of time to commit to these processes that often will fail several times on the path to succeeding. I also think the old name and shame approach doesn't have the same leverage that it does now in a world of misinformation and alternative facts and the rest. And I think for both better and worse, we have a much larger number of actors that are serious global powers and or middle powers. And therefore, if part of what's often key in these situations is trying to get an alignment externally, so that we can speak with one message into the country, that is more and more difficult. And again, there are many upsides of that proliferation and move away from the sort of Pax Americana moment, but it also does mean that if there are negative actors in a particular country, it's not hard for them to find at least one place to be able to look. So we can break into more of that, but I do think this notion that we are in a moment of very, very deep disruptions and uncertainty in the world sometimes does make it harder to be able to commit. I think it's a very big deal. The U.S. has been able to give almost $2 billion in humanitarian aid, even in these political times for Sudan. But that's also more than the rest of the world combined, which is really not where you would want this to be.
Tom, the minister is agitating to respond, so I'm going to give way to you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Commend your work, and I mean there has been progress on the humanitarian front, and it should be seen. But you are, of course, totally right that the lack of media focus on Sudan, and Sudan is possibly the most, the biggest humanitarian disaster on the planet. Or maybe Syria will come up to compete, but I mean, for the moment, I think it's Sudan. And there are other conflicts which are much more in attention. And I think one of the reasons is it's hard, if you don't know it like you do, and we to a certain extent do, we are there as well, it's hard to kind of organize your thoughts around it. It's just bad, but who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who are the people you will high-side it? It's much more difficult than in conflicts that you kind of feel that you understand, even if you understand it in opposite directions. But I think the point on implementation is incredibly important. I think in the early peace processes that we thought were successful, but then they failed, was partly because we were much more focused, or we, the international community, more focused on getting to the peace agreement, and then there will be elections, and then they will fix themselves. That, of course, doesn't work. You need to think about all the problems that will come down the line, and make sure you create optimism, but not, unfulfillable promises either, because that will come back to haunt you, which is also part of the lesson. And then the need to take risk. You will not get anywhere if you're not willing to take certain risks. And I think there's also many players who become rather risk averse, and that also is one of the reasons that there is less activity out there. But we try to stay risky from the Norwegian side.
We've got about 10 minutes, and I'd like to open it up to anybody who has questions in the audience. And I know that the ambassador, the Sudanese ambassador to Qatar, is in the room as well, if you would like to ask a question. But I want to challenge, while everybody's preparing their questions, I want to challenge the two of you, because you've both suggested, Foreign Minister and Tom, that there's a global silence on Sudan. I'd like to challenge that, because in the week of the United Nations General Assembly, Sudan, there were sideline conversations on Sudan in that week. The newspapers themselves, Sudanese themselves, have done a remarkable job to call to attention the plight of Sudan. And this was a conflict that did sort of capture a certain degree of imagination. So is it entirely accurate to say that there's a global silence? It may not always have the same headlines as Gaza and Ukraine, but there have been moments where it has had some audience. Is it a matter of also just deprioritizing Sudan? 20 years ago, Tom, your country led a significant campaign, Save Darfur, for example. 20 years ago, there was a reason why Sudan captured the imagination of the United States within the context of the war on terror. 20 years ago, also for Europe, the Horn of Africa was a vital center of strategic competition and concern as well. So is it accurate to say there's a global silence, or is there a sort of a deprioritizing of what matters today for countries as well? Either one of you can answer. Please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I definitely want to make clear that first and foremost, there's just been incredible courage of the Sudanese people to speak up throughout the conflict about the horrific atrocities and the conditions that are involved and the need for attention. I think we have seen a number of countries step up, certainly Norway on a number of fronts, including the humanitarian front, the U.S. has worked with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on a peace process at several moments, and the Egyptians have been trying to bring together coalitions, so there are people that are engaged. I think that there are a couple of aspects underneath it. One is that the tools that we are willing to talk seriously about, I think, have shrunk. So the fact that responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention were serious, though still nascent, doctrines or notions back at that time, and they were credible to talk about such peacekeeping forces. I think for a variety of reasons, those are not issues that have a much political will or seriousness at either the African Union or the United Nations level. So if you're not looking at that factor, U.S. still applies sanctions, and I think that has some effect, but even financial markets have diversified, or places, people have diversified their holdings, shall we say. I think on the voice issue too, one development over the years that's been mostly positive, but I think does get complicated in these cases, is most of the Western advocacy is eager to lead with Sudanese voices. And I think Sudanese civil society is not monolithic. And so when I talk to groups in the West about engaging, they're like, well, what we want to do is amplify local voices. This is not a conflict that fits neatly into a single narrative. And so if you are reporters, when I've talked to reporters who've been wanting to give this more coverage, it is a very complex story, and people kind of want to be able to fit it into one box or another of some narrative they already understand. So I think there have been tremendous efforts, particularly first and foremost by the Sudanese. You have incredible stories like the emergency response rooms that got nominated for a Nobel Prize, of just figuring out ways to create local kitchens in hundreds of communities. Very, very inspiring stories that I think deserve to be told. But I think at the same time, part of why those discussions at places like UNGA tend to produce more heat than light is that you've got to be willing to be for something. And so it's not just, hey, let's have a ministerial. Like, what leverage are you putting on the table, or dollars are you putting on the table? What are we willing to support to make a difference?
That's a good point. Sorry. And then,
No, I mean, first I think, no, it's absolutely no, you're right, there's not a total silence, and it has improved, frankly. And I had the same sense, and I was happy about it during Nanga, that suddenly Sudan was higher up, so that's true. But when you go back 20 years, the issue of Sudan, even before Save Darfur, was the civil war between what is now South Sudan and Sudan, and that led to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, and out of that the work towards the full independence of South Sudan, which was created with great fanfare, immediately recognized by 193 states. I think it took like 24 hours, but then we realized that it did not live up to its expectations, and we had a very tragic development in South Sudan, which we keep following because we are engaged in facilitating dialogue there, which I think is necessary. So and then came the Darfur campaign. But I think I honestly say, and I'm sad to say that, we do not have the attention on Sudan even now that we had 20 years ago. But I hope it will change. I hope it will go up on the agenda. But I think it has much, I agree with Tom, it is also because how do you kind of wrap your head around it, apart from saying we have to save the people?
I don't see any hands up in the audience. So, I see two now. Let me take the gentleman at the end, and then this gentleman here, and this lady here. Thank you. So we probably only have time for 3 questions. I'll ask you, please, no comment. Just go directly to your question, please. Can we have the microphone to this gentleman standing up in the corner? There, thank you. And I believe this is the Sudanese ambassador to Qatar. So thank you very much, Your Excellency, as well.
Thank you so much. My name is Ahmed Souardab. I'm the ambassador of Sudan to the state of Qatar. I'm delighted to be here to listen to Mr. Tombrello. He's the U.S. envoy to Sudan on the Sudanese issues, Foreign Minister of Norway. I happen to know him because I was serving in our embassy in Norway some time ago. Yes. Thank you for shedding the light on the issue of Sudan, first of all. Yes, as you truly said that Sudan is missing from the international media for a long time. Yes, we understand that Gaza and South Lebanon and elsewhere has captured the media or the concentration of media, but the focus of Sudan has been not in the light for a good deal of time. In our perspective, the issue of Sudan is a matter of foreign intervention. This is number one, and we have been saying that for a long time. We have filed a complaint in the Security Council, informing the international community. The foreign intervention is the one that fueling the conflict in Sudan, and is still fueling it up to this day. And if it wasn't for the foreign intervention, the conflict in Sudan would have ended in 1 week since it started. But because of this continuous armament for the other party through countries, regional countries and countries well known for everybody, that is still made the conflict still continuing up to this day. And no one knows until when. But the moment the foreign intervention is ended, the conflict will end. The humanitarian assistance, so forth, the international community committed themselves to provide humanitarian relief for the Sudanese. Only 30% has got now in Sudan.
Ambassador, do you have a specific question to the panel? Sorry to cut you off.
My question is, why do we don't see meaningful pressure on the countries that still providing armaments to the other side?
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Mr. Prelo is here.
Thank you.
Can answer.
I'll take the question from this gentleman here and this lady here, and then that will be it, and I'll bring it back to the panel. I'm sorry to have to all cut you off, but please, if you don't ask a question directly, I will cut you off. Sorry.
Hello, of course. Thank you so much for the very enlightening remarks. My question is this. In many cases, there are a lot of complications when it comes to creating peace deals, and there's a lot of global effort and attention towards making these peace deals. How can people on the ground translate the democratic process that many of the leaders of these nations want to facilitate these peace deals into the complications that exist to put pressure on leaders to actually execute these peace deals? And from your perspective, in previous cases, how effective has this been, and what ways can we make it more effective? Thank you very much.
Excellent. And I'll take this last question here, please. If you stand up so they can see, yeah, that's great.
Thank you. My question is to His Excellency the Foreign Minister. In an attempt to draw a parallel between Qatar's and Norway's peace efforts, given that they are both particularly third-party facilitators of different global conflicts, what are the costs that they have to pay because they're involved in conflicts beyond their borders?
That's a really good question. You talked about taking risk, Espen. This is a really good question. And then, Miriam, I'd like to also for you to answer the question from this young gentleman in terms of the realities on the ground versus the international actors. And Tom, there was a direct question about foreign actors' intervention into Sudan. Please, go ahead, Minister.
Well, a good question. And I think and we speak about these things between us, and one thing we, of course, because part of the entry to this is that we speak to all parties, we will, both of us, occasionally being called by one side or the other not to speak to X, Y, Z. So there's a long list of people I should not deal with and not speak with, groups that, and in the end, if I listen to all that advice, I would, in the end of the day, just call Sweden and ask how they are today, and then my job would be done. So stand up for the idea that dialogue is a good thing, and it's not endorsement or confirmation of positions, it's just that you have to open a space for bringing people together. And sometimes you will have to take positions that are a little bit out of the mainstream. But I think the long-term experience that, at least speaking for my country, is that over time, people come back and say, it was good that you did it. It was good that somebody took that position, and that keeps us going.
Good, excellent. Tom? I'm going to give the last word to Professor Yu.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, all of you, for caring about Sudan and paying attention on this issue. Let me generally agree with you, and then I'll add one caveat, Mr. Ambassador. We certainly agree that the external support must stop. We have helped lead on the extending the Darfur arms embargo. and getting the first sanctions there in 15 years. We've addressed our own sanctions increasingly to the issues of procurements and weapons flows. We think that this is true about the war in general, and particularly as we see the continued atrocities, including recent shelling by the RSF of Zamzam IDP camp, as well as atrocities in Sennar. I think if I wanted to add one caveat, I'm not convinced that necessarily the war would be over in a week, and without that. And I don't want to turn that into an academic argument. I think the issue is that, in general, with deals in the past in Sudan, there's been either a tendency to try to solve all of the underlying problems at once and then never get to an agreement, or ignore all of the underlying problems and have kind of a top-down deal that then does not last. And I think what I've heard from so many of the Sudanese people over the last year and the last 20 years, and so many, including in the SAF side and other sides as well, is, we need to help the Sudanese think through the right sequence of addressing issues. What are the issues that need to be solved to get to a ceasefire? What issues need to be solved in setting up civilian unity government and a transition to elections? So there are underlying issues which so much better than I do that go beyond just the issue of foreign intervention. So we agree with you absolutely that needs to stop. We also think that this issue of getting to a civilian unity government and process of addressing some of these longstanding issues are ones that are not only important to us, but most importantly, I think, are important to you and to all of the Sudanese people. So with that, I will thank you for the question.
Go ahead.
Maybe just a bit of thing about what's getting not enough attention. We have been talking about Sudan. But in our region, of course, there's the issue of Myanmar. But I guess the big difference between Myanmar and Sudan is that people are taking things in their hands. There's much more organized civil society having gone through their own democracy movement. There's a history of armed resistance, and they're all very clear about their own objectives. The real challenge now is really how to build the dialogue across all of these so that, in fact, the process is about these different layers of dialogues that are happening across the different actors. And that kind of a more inclusive process that's not just limited to, the standard negotiation between a state that is largely legitimate in any case in this sense, and the key actors, but really people-to-people dialogue and across the different ethnicities, the different types of resistance, whether civil or armed resistance. And that leads me to the question about the role of civil society. Certainly, they do play a big role. In fact, in our case, we have the strange distinction of not being ambassadors or even cabinet secretaries. We came from civil society. Most of the members in our negotiating team were people who were peace advocates, who were actually banging the doors throughout the decades, banging the doors on all the parties that are in conflict to come and sit down. And it took a long time before that. I mean, the road to get into the team, in my case, was the policy paper that we did as academics, actually, on how to leapfrog the stalemate that we all suffered from, because it generated another round of really massive displacement. So I think it's very important that all these local actors, as both basically acting as insider mediators, cannot underestimate the kind of pressure that they can also play. But of course, it also depends on what's there in the different contexts.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all three of you for laying out very clearly what is essential in the end to, these are iterative processes, and there's no one size fits all, there's no magic formula. I do appreciate also what you all said in your different ways, is that you have to talk to all sides to get to any serious peace process. On behalf of the audience, I want to thank all three of you for a very good debate. Thank you very much.